According to the White House, the president is set to direct Education Secretary Linda McMahon to, quote, take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return education authority to the states. Joining us now to discuss this further are Aaron Boxer, the CEO of Diversified Education Services and a former special education teacher, and Doctor of Education Stacey Schultz. She's a former teacher and school leader at the New York City Department of Education, and she's also the president of Educate. So Aaron, Stacey, thank you both so much for coming on today. Aaron, let's start with you, right? What, in your view, based on everything, all this back and forth that we're seeing right now, what would really be the most effective way to delegate responsibilities? I mean, is it really realistic for the federal government to completely step back from its role in education?
Yes, thanks for having me on. It's a good question. But first of all, this is long overdue. The Department of Education has had more than 40 years to prove that federal oversight improves student outcomes, and the numbers show the opposite. If reducing its size means less bureaucracy and less red tape and more control, then I think that's a win for students and teachers. I think that we don't have an exact answer. We got more of an answer today of what is going to happen with some of the sub-departments within the Department of Education, but they're still kind of figuring it out as they go. It seems a little bit like a ready, fire, aim situation. But if the Department of Education were actually improving student outcomes, we would have seen it in the data. We spent over $3 trillion on federal education programs, and the reading scores for eighth graders are at its lowest in 32 years. We have 1 in 3 students that can't read or can't see the difference between an odd and even number. So the DOE, it doesn't run schools, it doesn't employ teachers, it doesn't set education standards. It's just a middleman at this point, and it's taking tax dollars and attaching political strings. So we need to see something different happen, and I think that if we send the education back to the states and remove the bureaucracy, we have a better chance of doing that.
Stacey, your take.
Well, thank you for having me on, and Aaron, thanks for your take there. I think that can be problematic if we send it back to the states. There's then no oversight. There's no opportunity to have national standards. And I think in a country where we are United States, we should have some level of shared direction, what we're thinking for our system. And also, how are we funding our system? The states can't do all of the work they need to do with the current funding. And I know we're saying send it back, but what does that really mean? And what does that really look like is still yet to be seen.
All right. Now, Aaron, Stacey there mentions the very important issue of funding, and that has been a point of contention between the two sides of this debate. How do you read this issue?
And again, thank you, Stacey, for your take as well. And I think that the most important thing is that as educators, it's always got to be about kids first, right? I think that we all have that in common. The way we see it implemented might differ a little bit, but the Department of Education, it accounts anywhere between 8 to 14% of most state education budgets. So states already have their own education system. So cutting the Department of Education doesn't mean cutting funding. And I think the administration has been very clear that that's not going to happen. Same thing with civil rights. It just means moving programs kind of around the sinking ship, and what I'm calling the Department of Education at this point. So, special education, IDEA, if it winds up staying, great. If not, it would have been maybe moved to Health and Human Services. Title I funding, if it sounds like it's going to stay, but that could also have gone there. So the way that funding is existence, it's handled by departments that better fit a mission. So without the necessary bureaucracy, we're going to have more money for our kids because 47 cents out of every dollar actually goes to overhead, to administrative costs. And so I think without a Department of Education, we're going to have more money to give to our kids and put it through the states to come to our kids.
Stacey, you have experience, of course, in the education field. How do you read this?
Well, I think I disagree, right? We're talking about moving bureaucracy around, actually. We're not talking about getting rid of it. And so if we're really talking about how do we approach education better, can we take a step back and think about how might we restructure and reorganize rather than dismantling and then just sending money to other agencies to oversee how it then gets dispersed without the level of knowledge, the level of intimacy of knowing education, right? And then what happens and what kind of delays, what kind of chaos does that then create within these other divisions where it's just kind of getting shipped off to. And so that I don't really hear cutting bureaucracy, I hear it shifting around. And so I would love to see a more thorough approach to what does it look like to have a stronger Department of Education that really is about supporting our diverse national needs and ensuring all of our students continue to get meaningful access to that education, which is a really bold mandate that U.S. has really taken on.
All right, Erin, I want to get deeper into when we speak about funding. Of course, according to the Department of Education, there was around $1.6 trillion in federal student loans by just the end of 2024. Here's what Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had to say. She said that, quote, when it comes to student loans and Pell Grants, those will still be run out of the Department of Education. Any critical functions of the department will remain. How do you see that working out? If they keep the funds going in terms of student loans, will they be able to achieve the goals that President Trump seems to have laid out for Secretary McMahon?
It is about taking the funds that are being eaten up by this middleman or this bureaucracy and then reallocating them towards the states. That is the whole point of this. And over the last 45 years, we've seen scores vacillate, stagnate. We're the most wealthy country in the world, and we should have, if not the best, one of the top education systems in the country, in the world, and we don't. If there was a stock, a company that was not performing well it wouldn't last 45 years. It might not even last 45 months, right? So I think that the efficiency that's being handed down from top down is just it's not working. And I think that in the best interest of our kids, and that always needs to be the main part here, because when we're talking about politicians, sometimes kids get caught in the middle, right? They wind up being like a politicized football. And we don't want that. I think that we don't have a plan in place that I feel confident saying that, all right, if we don't have a Department of Education, what are we going to do? I think that there could be coalitions. We can put some state departments of head together. But one of the things that doesn't work here, that works in other places, is having some type of unified approach. But having a centralized federal government eating up the costs, I think that's what I have the real issue with.
Stacey, I see you nodding along to some of Erin's statements.
I mean, it's some of which I actually talked about Sunday on the evening news here on NTD. This idea of state coalitions is interesting. However, I think it creates an echo chamber of bias potentially that maybe doesn't really get over some of the challenges and inequities that we have across the United States. I also do believe, as I already mentioned, we could be thinking about how do we organize this better, and we really need to understand what is the plan going forward. Additionally, when we look at a lot of those countries across the world that are high performing, a lot of times those education systems are highly centralized. And again, that's a point I've made before. However, they're still, depending on the country, the local state or local educator has control over what does the curriculum and standards look like, which in fact in the U.S., the states do have a lot of control over what is the curriculum and standards that they're engaging with.
Erin, I think Stacey brings up a really interesting point there about this centralized education system working in other countries.
Right. No, they do. And that's something I think that a lot of us educators who want what's in the best interest of kids are looking at. Who are these countries that are ahead of us? France, Japan, Finland, all have really great education systems. South Korea. And they do have some type of centralized education system, but they don't have teacher unions that interfere with policy. And I know that people get really sensitive about the conversation around unions because they do play an important role in protecting workers, not just in education but other places. But we have the NEA and the AFT, and they control education policy more than any government agency. They have a lot of impact. They have a lot of influence. They're one of the reasons why Jimmy Carter was elected president. So I think that looking at what some of the positives are and seeing if we can bring some of that over here, also keeping in mind that we're a very large country. We're not the same size as some of these other smaller countries that have what are considered to be better education systems. So I think there's a lot to be learned. I would like a little more time to figure that out before we start, dismantling, although it doesn't appear as of the news today that's going to happen. It's going to be cut down a lot. But I think we have a lot to learn, and we need to figure a way to do it because, our kids are depending on us.
Absolutely. And when we talk about student performance, I have some numbers here from the White House. Actually, math and reading scores for 13-year-olds are at the lowest level in decades. 6 in 10 fourth graders and nearly 3/4 of eighth graders are not proficient in math. And then 7 in 10 fourth and eighth graders are not proficient in reading, while 40% of fourth grade students don't even meet basic reading levels. Now, of course, regardless of which side of this debate you're on, these numbers, they're concerning, of course. Both of you have personal experience in terms of teaching students and being in contact with kids in America. What do you guys see as the main challenge being for these students, and what type of support do both students and these teachers need? Stacey?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought it up. First of all, I'd love to fact check that, which I can't at this moment, because I know there's been numbers out of the White House before that haven't been accurate, but we can say on testing, we know we're lower. One thing I will say is when we talk about learning from other countries and what they're doing, one of the things a lot of the countries do is de-emphasize testing. Here in this country, we have such a high culture of testing, and not in every school system and not in every school in the school systems. And even for myself as a teacher, one of the things I really focused on was not having my curriculum around the tests, but teaching students how to critically think and approach non-familiar topics, subjects, questions with a set of thinking skills versus how do you take this test and how do you approach that? And I really think that that practice is not generalized across all of our schools. So many of our schools do focus too much on what is the test, how do we teach to the test, rather than how do we really support students where they're at and teach them those critical skills that are further being important as AI is coming into our world in education and in the labor force, period.
Absolutely. Aaron?
Yeah, I think that, and I can't necessarily validate, but I've seen the same numbers as you have, and those are the NAEP scores, and that's like our nation's report card, and they're not good. Getting back into and incorporating the union piece, unlike some other fields, teachers are protected by the unions. The average teacher leaves their job after 3.5 years, which is interesting because if you don't make tenure, it usually happens around that 3 to 4 year mark, right? I think that we do have teachers that teach too much to the test. That's not something that is proven to improve outcomes. But there's those federal strings that I talked about, that bureaucracy that impacts the way that education is taught in the classroom, and that's something that we need to change. I think that keeping unions in some way might be useful, but at the same time, if we're going to protect teachers that are low performers, then we're doing our kids a disservice. In Finland, they take the top 10% of teachers in their education program and they give them jobs, right? I don't necessarily think that would work here, but we need to make sure there's some type of uniformity, at least at the state level, with our teacher preparation programs to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward. Because in some states, like here in New Jersey, they're taking away some of the tests to qualify for reading to be a teacher. And I think that's just moving in the wrong direction. Again, that's a state issue, but we need some guidance. And I think putting some of these heads together, we can come up with something.
All right, I've got a little bit of time left here. Closing statements for both of you. We're already seeing legal challenges. Just last week, attorneys general from 20 states and the District of Columbia as well, they filed that lawsuit when the Department of Education announced that it was going to lay off 1,300 employees. In the next few days and weeks, what are you expecting? Aaron?
I think we're going to see a lot more of the same. I think we're going to have a lot of back and forth. I think, again, it's a ready, fire, aim. I think that the Trump administration has these mandates that they feel like they've been handled, and they're trying to do what they think is best. And I think that the best approach, which is to limit government, having more government interference, isn't necessarily a good thing. But also, the DOE has been around for 40 years. It's They've had time to prove themselves. The data speaks for itself, and I'm giving them an F. We don't need more federal control or more bureaucracy or more regulations. Local control, parent involvement, school choice. At the end of the day, setting kids up for success is really what's important, and that's not going to happen by expanding government power.
And Stacey, you get the last word today.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what Aaron shared is not directly connected to the Department of Education. And those measures and things can be really examined without dismantling the Department of Education in the way. And I will ground again on, we really need to consider, how do we build this up to ensure that we're having national standard, that that every student in America is able to realize the passion, the work, the life that they want. And by dismantling this and taking it local, in my opinion, just makes more inequities and less of that a reality.
Aaron Boxer, Stacey Schultz, thank you so much for joining us today. Very important conversation to be having.
Thank you both.